Welcome to the Standard Theory of Psychology. In the previous segments we discussed the abnormal processes related to the R scale and intelligence. In this segment we will move from the R scale over to the Z scale. On the Z scale, in a constructive sense, each cycle of communication, whether in a positive or negative direction, is defined by the process of vertical thinking. In vertical thinking, the requirement of attaining a complete cycle of communication using impulse, subtraction and compression contributes to the overall interval ratio unit of communication. In an abnormal sense, any of these processes can be experienced in an irregular fashion. When this happens, the contribution of each of these parts do not add up to the interval ratio unit. Instead, there is some irregular amount of information that is attained overall. Since there are several factors that can lead to these abnormal processes, each of the irregular processes can be referred to as a complex version of that process. This provides the idea of a complex impulse, a complex subtraction and a complex compression. In a constructive sense, a compression is the terminal point of any cycle of communication, and, assuming any other part of that communication cycle is complex, the compression can be expected to be complex as well. For that reason, complex compression as it relates to a complete communication cycle can be referred to as simply a complexity. In that way, we can correlate any number of irregular cycles as that number of complexities rather than stating complex impulse followed by compression, complex subtraction followed by complex compression and complex compression without subtraction and without impulse. In order to describe those three abnormal cycles of communication, we can refer to those as three complex cycles of communication or as three complexities. In this way we can refer to any abnormal cycle of communication on the R scale, from -118 all the way to 197 and beyond, by identifying the communication type and from there identifying the number of complexities related to that communication type. This can be achieved using the Z scale along with the idea of complexities. This can also be achieved using the Z range scale. On the Z range scale, all communication begins at the turnaround of -180 characteristics. Once there, each cycle of communication is evaluated for the impulse, subtraction and compression. Depending on the context, the number of cycles of communication may vary. In an abnormal sense, some of those cycles will contain unknown or complex processes. Anytime an unknown process is observed to be communicated, that specific process can be denoted using a complex number. From there we can determine the magnitude of communication being displayed. From there, we can determine how many total characteristics are complex. From there, we can compare the total cycles of communications to the number of complexities. From there, we can decompose the magnitude of communication in order to determine where the true complexity originates. Previously, when discussing shared communication, the idea of decomposing communication was done by removing social identities or 9 characteristics from the resulting characteristic. On the Z range scale, the number of social identities that are removed are equivalent to the number of communication cycles. In this way we are able to decompose the constructive aspects of those cycles with a remainder of the abnormal processes. This gives a much closer approximation to the unresolved cycle of communication and provides some information about what has caused the irregularity in the first place in terms of what is missing or what is extra. By using either the Z scale with complexities or the Z range scale, we can observe some magnitude of communication. By comparing that magnitude of subtractions to the processes of the R scale, we can get some information about where the intelligent version of that communication might have occurred. This allows us to associate these processes with a high energy characteristic. For this reason, the Z range scale and Z scale with complexity allow us to account for the processes that contribute to incomplete cycles of communication. Beyond standard theory, the study of the relation between the R scale and Z scale is explored in a study called STEM psychology. The STEM in STEM psychology is short for scientifically and statistically transmutable supersocial and metaphysical psychology. This study allows for some generalizations of the patterns of activation seen on the R scale and the Z scale. These are things such as personality types, emotions, IQ intervals, S-values in spherical derangement, complex magnitudes, complex distancing and complex characteristics. Each of these can be discussed at a later point. For now, though, we can continue to the final thinking type, which measures the amount of irregularity in communication. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss cyclic thinking and its communication types.